But what especially sets Perth apart is the possession of one of the world's largest and finest parks, Kings Park, spread across 1,000 comely acres on a bluff above the broad basin of the Swan River. Kings is all those things a city park should be: playground, sanctuary, strolling area, botanical garden, vantage point, memorial, and so big that you can never feel as if you have seen it all. Most of it is arrayed in a conventional manner: undulant lawns, paths, flower beds, but a substantial corner, constituting perhaps a quarter of the whole, has been left as unimproved bush. It was while strolling down a sunny path through this little visited zone that I saw a small furry hemisphere, rather like the brush portion of a floor polisher, emerge from the undergrowth on one side of the path and proceed with stately lack of haste toward identical undergrowth on the other side. Sensing me, it stopped. It had glossy black quills pointing straight back, and had curled itself roughly into a ball, so I couldn't see its pointy snout, but it was clearly an echidna. It could be nothing else. I couldn't have been more thrilled. It was a little pathetic, I grant you, when you consider that this was my most exciting moment of engaging a creature in the wild in Australia. In a country filled with exotic and striking life forms, my high point was finding a harmless, animated pincushion in a city park. I didn't care. It was a monotreme, a physiological anomaly, a wonder of the reproductive world, an oddity from the loneliest branch on the mammalian tree. When the echidna sensed that I had retreated to a respectful distance, it unfurled and continued on its waddling way into the bush. Thrilled to my cloaca, I followed the path around and back into the park proper, where I came after some time to a long, lovely avenue of tall white gum trees planted long ago to commemorate the fallen of World War I. Each tree bore a small plaque giving bare details, unexpectedly moving when read one after another down a long walk of an abbreviated life. In honor of Captain Thomas H. Bourne, 44th Bat, said one, killed in action, Passchendaele, 4th October 1917, aged 25, dedicated by his wife and daughter. It is a fact little noted outside Australia, and I think worth at least a mention here, that no other nation lost more men as a proportion of population in World War I than Australia. Out of a national population of under 5 million, Australia suffered a staggering 210,000 casualties, 60,000 dead, 150,000 injured. The casualty rate for its soldiers was 65%. As John Pilger has put it, no army was as decimated as that which came from farthest away, and all were volunteers. Only a few days earlier, In one of the weekend papers, I had read a review of a new history of World War I by the British historian John Keegan. In passing, the reviewer had noted with an all but palpable sign that Keegan's 500 pages of densely observed text had failed to include a single mention of the Australian forces. Poor Australia, I thought. Other countries produce unknown soldiers. It produces unknown armies. Weeks later in London, I checked the Keegan book and it was full of references to the Australian army. The conclusion to draw from this, I guess, is that Australians so expect to be overlooked that they sometimes overlook not being overlooked, so to speak. Beyond this somber avenue lay the much parkier and sunnier realm of the botanical gardens, and this I approached now with unusual devotion, for Australia's plants are exceptional and there is no place where you will find them more handsomely displayed. Australia really is the most amazingly fecund country. It is thought to contain something on the order of 25,000 species of plants. Britain, for purpose of comparison, has 1,600 species, but that's really only a guess. At least a third of what is out there has never been named or studied, and new stuff is turning up all the time, often in the most unlikely places. In 1989, in Sydney, for instance, scientists found an entirely new species of tree called Alacasuarina portuensis. People had been living around these trees for 200 years, but because they weren't very numerous, just 10 have been found, no one had noticed them before. In much the same way, in 1994, in the Blue Mountains, some botanist out for a walk happened on another of those unexpected relic species long presumed to be extinct. Called Wollemi pines, these were not modest shrubs hidden among tall grasses, but stout and imposing trees up to 130 feet tall and 10 feet around. It's just that with such a lot of land to survey and only so many botanists to go around, it took a while for the two to intersect. Nobody can guess, of course, what else might be out there awaiting discovery. This is, of course, what makes Australia such a fundamentally exciting place to engage in the natural science. In Britain or Germany or America, you might, with great luck, find a new strain of mountaintop lichen or some sprig of previously overlooked moss. But in Australia, take a stroll through the bush and you can find half a dozen unnamed wildflowers, a grove of Jurassic angiosperms, and probably a 10-kilo lump of gold. I know where I'll be working if I were in science. The question that naturally occurs in all this is why Australia, which so often seems singularly hostile to life, has produced such an abundance of it. Paradoxically, half the answer lies in the very poverty of the soil. In the temperate world, most plants can prosper in most places. An oak tree can grow as productively in Oregon as it can in Pennsylvania. And so A relatively few generalist species tend to predominate. In poor soils, on the other hand, plants are driven to specialize. One species will learn to tolerate soils containing, say, high concentrations of nickel, an element that other plants find distasteful. Another will become tolerant of copper. Yet another might learn to tolerate nickel and copper and perhaps prolonged drought as well. And so it goes. After a few million years, you end up with a landscape filled with a great variety of plants, each favoring very specific conditions than each master of a patch of ground that few other plants could abide. Specialized plants lead to specialized insects, and so on up the food chain. The result is a country that seems on the face of it hostile to life, but in fact it's wonderfully diversified. The second, more obvious factor in Australia's variety is isolation. 50 million years as an island clearly sheltered indigenous life forms from a great deal of competition and allowed certain of them, eucalyptus in the plant world, marsupials in the animal world, to prosper uncommonly. But no less important in the terms of species diversity is the isolation that has long existed within Australia. In general terms, Australia comprises scattered pockets of life separated by great zones of harshness, and nowhere is all of this more true than in southwestern Australia. According to David Attenborough in The Private Life of Plants, this one corner of Australia contains no less than 12,000 different plant species, and 87% of them grow nowhere else in the world. Which makes it alarming to report that many of these singular plants are in trouble from a terrible and little understood malady called dieback. Dieback comes from a fungus genus called Phytophthora, which is related to the fungus that caused the potato blight in Ireland. It has been in Australia for a century and has affected plants all over the country, though the source wasn't identified by science until 1966. It is especially a worry in southwest Australia, partly because it thrives there as nowhere else, and partly because the southwest has such a density of rare and vulnerable plants. I discovered now from an informative signboard that even Banksias are under threat. The Banksia, named for its discoverer Joseph Banks, is perhaps the most adored flower in Australia. It's a bit of an oddity. The flowers look uncannily like toilet brushes, but Australians love it because it is striking and it is everywhere and it is theirs alone. So it was discouraging to read that 7 species of Banksia are on the endangered list and could well become extinct in the wild in the next few years. 12 more species are under threat. Perhaps it's my natural pessimism, but it seems that an awfully large part of trouble these days is to see things while you still can. The most disturbing thought of all, I suppose, is that with so much still unrecorded, many plants could disappear before they are even found. All of this was some moment because I was about to go off on a small botanical quest of my own. First, however, I had a day at leisure in Paris. I had nothing very particular in mind, but a few minutes later, as I sat on the shady terrace of the park's central cafe, decorating my face with a chocolatey froth of cappuccino and reading the West Australian newspaper, I came upon a news article that planted the possibility of an idea. The article was to do with a man named Lang Hancock, about whom I had lately been reading. Hancock was a rancher in the remote north of Western Australia who had the exceptional good fortune to be at the heart of one of the greatest mineral booms in modern history. Anyone who doubts that Australia truly is a lucky country has only to review the story of the country's mineral discoveries in the 1950s and a little beyond. Up until that time, conventional wisdom held that Australia was deficient in almost all natural resources. Iron ore, for instance, was considered to be in such short supply that for 2 decades it was illegal to export it. Then, in 1952, Lang Hancock made an important discovery. While piloting a light aircraft over the trackless emptiness of the Hamersley Ranger near the north coast, he lost his bearings in a sudden storm and made a forced landing in a zone of flat rock known to geology as the Western Shield. Stepping from his airplane, he realized that he was standing on almost solid iron. Looking into the matter further, he discovered that he owned a 100-kilometer-long block of nearly solid iron ore. From almost nothing in 1950, Australia's estimated reserves of iron ore rose to 20 billion tons in 1960. By the end of the 1960s, Hancock alone controlled iron ore reserves greater than those of the United States and Canada combined. That is a lot of iron ore. But it was only the beginning. In dizzying succession, mineral deposits were found all over the place. Bauxite, nickel, manganese, uranium, copper, lead, diamonds, tin, zinc, zircon, rutile, ilmenite, and many others that most of us have never heard of. Almost overnight, people with mining interests made fortunes that were embarrassing to contemplate and impossible to spend. The stock markets went crazy as investors scrambled to grab a piece of the action. In Sydney, one broker lost an ear in the frenzied trading that accompanied the constant reports of new discoveries. It was a heady period, and it transformed Australia's fortunes. From a sleepy, good-natured producer of wool, it became a mining colossus, the world's biggest exporter of minerals. As many of the biggest finds were in Western Australia, much of the wealth settled in Perth, the state capital, which is what accounts for all its skyscrapers. Lang Hancock, the man who started it all, was called to the Great Iron Mountain in the sky in 1992, but in his dotage, it appears, he did That's that thing that brings dread to the hearts of rich children everywhere. He married his housekeeper, a lady from the Philippines named Rose. According to the morning paper, Hancock's daughter had filed a lawsuit alleging that the widow Rose and the late Mr. Hancock had lavishly and improperly spent money that was not their own. Helpfully, the article provided a sidebar in which Mrs. Hancock's principal assets were listed. These included 35 million Australian dollar house in a Perth suburb called Mosman Park, complete with the address. It was apparently a grandest residence in the city. The chandeliers alone had cost 3 million Australian dollars. Looking at my map of the city, I realized that Mosman Park was at the far end of a clutch of famously well-heeled suburbs running all the way to Fremantle, and as it was a fine day and I was feeling perky, I decided to walk out. Well, it's a long way from Central Perth to Mosman Park and beyond. That's all I'm saying. I walked for hours through the leafy sprawl of the University of Western Australia campus and around the sunny foreshore of the Swan River estuary, tracing the sweep of sunny bays and yacht-clattering coves, and made my way at length into residential zones of startling showy wealth. Nedlands, Dalkeith, Peppermint Grove, where palatial houses basked in a penetrating sunshine. These neighborhoods went on for miles, just street after foot-wearing street of trophy homes with big gates beside broad drives, patios adorned with Grecian urns on ornate plinths, and garages for fleets of cars. It was a stunning demonstration of the proposition that money and taste don't always or even often go together. These were the houses of lottery winners, of retailers of the sort who appear in their own television commercials, of people for whom the words Peppermint Grove in an address would not be an embarrassment. I would not suggest for a moment that Australia's nouveau riches are more distant from refinement than people of other lands, but the absence of a distinctive architectural vernacular in Australia does mean that people can take their styles from a wider range of sources, principally drive-in banks, casinos, upmarket nursing homes, and ski lodges. To see it massed over a spread of miles as in the western suburbs of Perth is certainly an absorbing experience. I had been walking for nearly 3 hours when I arrived at the landmark called Chidley Point and realized I had found Mosman Park. I delved in my bag for the newspaper to check the address and discovered that I had evidently left it on the table at the cafe in Kings Park. Never mind, I had walked 8 or 9 miles by now and had seen enough extravagant real estate to last me a lifetime. I vaguely recalled the Hancock House as being on Wellington Street, so I found my way to this sedate thoroughfare and strolled along in. En route, I saw perhaps 8 houses that looked as if they might contain many $1 million worth of bricks, mortar, garden ornaments, and tinkling chandeliers, but nothing that announced itself unequivocally as the grandest pile in the metropolis. As I stood there, a young woman in shorts and a matching top, a professional dog walker, I supposed, came along behind a frisky dog not much smaller than a pony. She wasn't so much walking the dog as skiing behind it on the soles of her shoes. I stepped into the street to keep from being eaten, but I asked as she passed if she knew the Hancock House, and she pointed to a place about 3 doors up. I went and had a look. Considering the cost, I have to say I had expected rather more. A sort of San Simeon meets Liberace's dream mausoleum is what I believe I had in mind, but this was on a smallish lot and was neither particularly tacky nor outstandingly ornate. I studied it for a few minutes, struck by the somewhat tardy thought that although I had voluntarily invested a good deal of exertion to get here, I didn't actually care in the tiniest degree where Rose Hancock dwelled. This notion absorbed, I turned with a thoughtful countenance and continued on my long march to the sea. Although Fremantle, population 24,000, is now effectively just a coastal suburb of Perth, historically it is a separate community and ferociously defends in its independent identity. You will even sometimes see it characterized as Perth's sister city. Centrally, it has a quite separate feel to it. In gold rush days, it was a port of cosmopolitan liveliness, but then it sank into a long period of decrepitude. In the 1970s, it underwent a gentrifying revival as people realized the commercial potential of its large stock of neglected Victorian buildings. So today it is a trendy hangout, a place of latte and gelato and little shops selling things of an arty nature. Everybody is fond of Frio, as they call it. So am I normally, though my enthusiasm was wilting swiftly this day. The afternoon was uncomfortably warm, with no sign of the ameliorating ocean breeze they call the Fremantle Doctor, because it makes you feel better, of course. I had already walked far enough to make my feet smoke when I realized that I still had a good 4 miles to go, nearly all of it along the busy, charmless, mercilessly shadeless Starling Highway. By the time I flopped into central Fremantle, it was late afternoon and I was comprehensively bushed. I went into a pub and downed a beer for medical purposes. "You all right?" said the barmaid. "Yeah," I replied. "Why?" "Seen your face?" I knew at once. "Am I sunburned?" I asked bleakly. She gave a frank, sympathetic, but essentially deeply amused nod. I peered past her into the mirror behind the bar, looking back at me mockingly attired in clothes to match my own was a cartoon character called Mr. Tomato Head. I allowed myself a small sigh. For the next 4 days, I would be a source of concern to every elderly Western Australian and of amusement to all else. Then for 3 days more, as my skin flaked and peeled, and I took on the look of someone just escaped from a leprosarium, the mood would change to universal horror and revulsion. Waitresses would drop trays. Gawkers would walk into lampposts. Ambulance drivers would slow as they passed and look me over carefully. It would, as always, be quiet ordeal. In another 3 or 4 hours I would be in tender pain. Meanwhile, I was already a small wreck. My feet and legs hurt so much that I wasn't sure that they would ever be of service to me again. I was as dirty as a street urchin and rank enough to be buried. And all of this so that I could see a house I had no actual interest in seeing, and then walk on to a place that I was now too tired to explore. But I hardly minded at all. And do you know why? I had seen a monotreme. Life could throw nothing at me that would diminish the thrill of that. Sustained by this thought, I drained my beer, lowered myself gingerly from the bar stool, and limped through the staring crowds to see if I could find a taxi to take me back to the city.